Hello everyone, welcome back to another out of order Grim Dawn Improv class build, or skill guide actually would be the better term here. I got a question from T8365 as to Vire's Might fire damage and, whether or not it would be recommended to focus on fire damage given that the secondary class was Demolitionist. The short answer is, frankly, yes, it is perfectly viable. But I decided to skip to covering the Shieldbreaker, aka the Oathkeeper Demolitionist combination, specifically to better and fully answer this question. So the long answer is essentially, it's your choice, right? The interesting thing about the Shieldbreaker is that you, unlike the solo Oathkeeper who really leans heavily on physical, you have a little bit more choice whether or not your primary damage type is going to be physical or fire. You have a bit more leeway to choose fire if you want to, as was the case, or as is the case for T8365, right? Now, let's talk about this because there are, broadly speaking, four realistic ways of approaching this. Alright, because let me tell you right off the top that a Path of the Three Shieldbreaker is really not a strong option. Okay, there is one specific build that can make that work, but that requires a little bit of the luck of the draw, or to be more specific, luck of the forge, to make that work. And I will eventually be covering specific builds at some point in the future. I want to focus on the improv builds at this time because I think it's more broadly applicable to people either trying out new masteries or playing the game for the first time. So improv, I think, is a bit of a better jumping off point because we can build off of this and talk about more specific builds. Alright, now first off, when you're building a shield breaker, at the end of the day, the bulk of your points are going into Oathkeeper, okay? The primary reason for this is because you actually have access to an exclusive skill through the Oathkeeper, alright? Specifically Divine Mandate, obviously, which is increasing your physical fire and internal trauma damage. Lovely time. Demolitionist does not have this, right? Ulzwin's Chosen isn't an exclusive skill and only affects 3 skills. 3 skills we don't really specifically need either. So we're really going to be using the Demolitionist for accessory damage, so to speak, okay? That's really where we're going with this. So, the 4 ways you can really approach Shieldbreaker. There's going to be some mild variation, obviously, but you have 4 broad ways. Alright, I'm going to talk about single-hand melee with shield, because that's what a lot of people think about with Oathkeeper, and that is, quite frankly, going to be what a lot of people will probably default to. Okay, now, you have a couple of really interesting options, and which one of these two, right off the top you have 2 choices. Which one you choose is going to depend mostly on either your equipment or your preference. For me, it's my equipment. Alright, if I get, well, let's actually talk about the skills first. When you play, a shield breaker and you're going single-hand melee with a shield, you can choose either to use Fire Strike or you can choose to use Righteous Fervor. Which one of these mostly depends upon, again, either your personal preference or if you get any items that increase one or the other. Obviously, if you get an item that increases Righteous Fervor, use Righteous Fervor. It's going to be a little bit more effective than Fire Strike. If you get something that increases Fire Strike's skill points, use Fire Strike, right? That pretty much goes without saying, unless you have a really strong preference for one or the other. Now, why would you have a preference? Well, quite honestly, Righteous Fervor here, right off the top, we're getting physical and burn damage, right? That's absolutely lovely. We have 150% weapon damage here, which is really nice, but not quite as nice with the single-hand melee, obviously, right? And right here, we have 122% weapon damage. Now, that sounds bad. It's really not that big of a deal. Again, we're talking about a single-hand melee weapon. That is not a huge difference. The percentage might look really sizable. It's 28%. But in terms of the damage output of your typical single-hand melee, it's really not that big of a problem. Obviously, again, with Demolitionist, actually, let's just bring the skill points up here, because this is where we're really going to be talking about. You get Explosive Strike, right? And this adds on an additional 30% weapon damage, so now you're exceeding, but more importantly, you're getting 54 flat physical damage on this, and you're getting a small AoE, and that's the really interesting part here. The small AoE tends to be a little more helpful in regular and modded single-player experiences, because that AoE is going to weaken down the enemies adjacent to the one you're hitting, which is incredibly helpful in those circumstances, especially since, from what I've seen, they seem to have slightly increased the number of monsters in the base game with the latest update, but that's just my personal experience. Whereas the second stage of Righteous Fervor gets us Consecration, which increases our defense, it increases our armor, our elemental resistance, and it gives us more defensive ability. It also increases our attack speed a little bit, which is also really nice, but this is more of a defensive side, so it's at this point that you're really going to establish where your preferences lie. Alright, the first stage of each of these, Righteous Fervor and Firestrike, not really a huge difference. Firestrike is slightly weaker in most circumstances, right? Because you have 38 fire damage flat with a plus 56% physical damage and the 122% weapon damage, right? This is 46 flat physical damage, 150% increased weapon damage, and 147 burn damage plus 90% physical and burn as well. So Righteous Fervor is a little stronger in terms of pure damage. In default, I think a lot of people are going to choose Righteous Fervor for that reason, but it's the second stage that really is where you're going to have to make your decision, again, assuming equipment keeps all things equal. Explosive Strike, definitely the more damaging option here, a little bit better for clearing out larger waves of enemies, whereas the Consecration is going to be a bit more about durability. It's going to be a bit better for multiplayer games where you're maybe combining this with the taunt effect of Aegis and playing as your group's tank. Consecration here is going to be more useful to you, right? For the third stage, you could, of course, go all the way to Retribution. It's going to increase your damage a little bit here, of course, right? But now here comes the real serious issue. Now this increases your damage if you have the other two stages of Righteous Fervor. There's no real reason why you wouldn't want Retribution, but for Demolitionist, this becomes a much more complicated subject. See, for Oathkeeper, we already know we want to work our way up the Divine Mandate, right? We already have that in our heads. Maybe we don't rush it like I've set up in this example. Actually, let's pull those points out really quick, because that's not realistically where you would go with that. Right, let's actually scale this back so we can have a better conversation about the difference between Righteous Fervor and Firestrike. This becomes relevant for the other three builds as well, by the way. But anyways, so, you're at the 15 point here with the Consecration. For the Demolitionist, you're at the 15 point here. If you're using a single-hand melee weapon, you would obviously be running Searing Strike, right? That just makes sense. But in order to get up to Static Strike, there are two real problems, right? This is up to 25, this is up to 32, but we already know we're going over here at some point. We don't need to go all the way up to All's Winds Chosen, okay? We just don't need that, okay? In fact, very rarely do I even go past 20. There are reasons why. We'll get to that in a second. But even if we went all the way to Static Strike, as I've said in previous videos, I'm not the biggest fan of this, because this is only a... Let's actually go up there and just look at this as it levels up. This is only a % chance of lightning damage. Now, it gets to be a pretty good chance. It winds up to be 70%, which is not bad. It's a little over 2/3 of the time. Or, if you want to put it in terms of fractions, it's 7 out of 10 of your attacks are going to be dealing bonus lightning damage. But you're probably thinking, Professor, aren't we focusing on physical and fire? You are absolutely correct. While it is nice to have the 25% chance of knockdown and the plus 50% fire damage, at the end of the day, you're really only looking to get Static Strike for 2 of its 3 effects. Whereas with Oathkeeper, again, we already want to be pumping points into the mastery bar for Oathkeeper, and we're also getting retaliation damage added to our attack. we're getting increased fire and internal trauma damage, and we're adding flat internal trauma damage to our auto attacks. So for single-hand melee, generally speaking, I do prefer Righteous Fervor, but if you are playing solo and you're having some crowd control issues, it is totally fine, or if you've got equipment, or if you just prefer it, frankly, you can absolutely go for Explosive Strike. You grab the Searing Strike for better crits. You do a little bit more damage with this, which is really particularly nice with the AoE effect here. You have reduced skill energy costs, so, you know, your energy management is a little bit here. Actually, we'll pop it up to this really quick right here. But you've got, you know, all these great options. So, in the long term, Righteous Fervor is going to be a little bit stronger for the Shieldbreaker in the majority of cases. We'll talk about the other 3 case scenarios where that is also pretty true. But for at least the single-hand melee, you've got a really good argument here where, pardon me, where you are basically choosing between better crowd management or better defense. It's basically the big options there. Anyways, so in this particular sample, we are going to... There's a second reason why you might want Fire Strike. We'll talk about that at the end, but we're going to begin with Righteous Fervor for a moment here. Now, again, we are assuming single-hand melee. We are assuming a shield. Alright. Now, you have, interestingly enough, 2 real options here. We want to be a little bit more efficient here with our skill point usage, because unlike the solo Oathkeeper, we have Demolitionist skills that are incredibly useful that we want to get our hands on. Despite that, we're still going to want Safeguard. Okay, this is just too universally useful. Plus 72% all of our damage, 38 physical damage, plus 95 armor. It's just a lovely time. We all love it. But something that I really want to address is this conversation of Aegis or Virus Might. Now, you might be curious, Professor, why do you have to choose? Well, you don't have to, obviously, first off. But second off, you also don't need both. Okay? Aegis of Menhir is a ranged attack. Hits up to, like, I think it's 5 targets total with Avenging Shield, actually. I misquoted that in the last video. It's up to 5 targets. Obviously, I had to bring... Actually, I think it goes up to, like, 6, doesn't it? No, it's just... This goes 4. Yeah, it doesn't reflect that. I didn't think it did, but I believe it's 5 targets, actually, if memory serves me. You can actually just watch my part 1 of my playthrough and see it hit 5 people. But anyways, so this is a ranged attack, right? This is a dash that brings you in melee range. You don't need both of these, okay? Now, which one do I prefer? I prefer Virus Might. Why? A couple of specific reasons, but first let's talk about Virus Might. Now, Virus Might, you've got the dash, right? Obviously, hold on, really quick note. Even though I prefer Virus Might, in the short term, I put some points into Aegis of Menhir to better manage early game bosses and heroes, Kizog, the zombie triplets, etc. Right? Early game, they're just easier to deal with using Aegis of Menhir. Random heroes are easier to deal with using Aegis of Menhir. It's just put the points in Aegis of Menhir temporarily, pull them out, and get Virus Might when you get to the 10-point area. But, back to the point, Virus Might, being that dash, putting you in the physical location of the enemies, is a really great thing. Now, do you want Volcanic Might? Generally speaking, this depends on whether or not you're looking at the physical or fire damage, right? Now, with Demolitionist, I typically do, in fact, run the Volcanic Might, right? And then Volcanic Stride here, right? Now, whether or not you want to go for Tectonic Shift is totally up to you. If I'm focusing on fire damage, I really don't, because we are talking about... Yes, we do have a reduced, skill recharge, but we're adding on bleeding damage and internal trauma damage that we aren't hyper-focused on, alright? There's also a second reason why we don't need to care that much about internal trauma damage, but we're going to leave Tectonic Shift behind here for a second. So, leaving Tectonic Shift alone, we at the very least want Volcanic Stride, we want Volcanic Might, and we have Virus Might here, right? We have a lot of this fire damage. Great. Lovely. Now comes the reason why I prefer Virus Might, and that answer is really specifically in Vindictive Flame. This is just constant physical and fire damage to all enemies around you. 1/3 of the time, they're going to be stunned, alright? And this procs every 1.5 seconds, by the way, just anyone who's near you. It increases your move and attack speed by 16%, which helps your Righteous Fervor or your Fire Strike, whichever one you've picked. It increases your health regeneration. Alright, this is, besides even the fire retaliation, obviously, but this is absolutely fantastic. And this doesn't care about Aegis of Menhir, because Aegis of Menhir is keeping you away from the enemy. But Virus Might is putting you right in their face. In other words, you can force the activation of Vindictive Flame here via the use of Virus Might. Okay, this is why I prefer Virus Might, just to get them in range of Vindictive Flame. Okay, that is so huge. Alright, and we'll typically grab Flame Touched as well for increased fire damage, which is a lovely time. Okay, now, what else we grab does somewhat depend upon what else we want to do, right? You'll notice we have 87 points here. We obviously want to be boosting this up to here, right? We want to have Divine Mandate. We also really, really want the Guardians of Empyrean for the Celestial Presence. Okay, lovely. Now we've got just shy of 30 points. Where do I put these normally, and when do I mix this up? Well, this really depends at this particular point in time, again, on whether or not I'm playing solo, whether or not I'm playing with friends and family. If I'm playing with other people, I'm typically going to be throwing at least enough points to max judgment. Again, we're trying to max out that target area. We're trying to taunt as many people as possible. It's particularly important to do this if playing with other people because we aren't using Aegis of Menhir. And again, as I mentioned in the solo Oathkeeper video, Virus Might is really a great combo with Judgment because you get to be, you force the issue. You are choosing that battleground. Boom, there you are in their face using Judgment and pulling everyone that isn't knocked down, right? Whether you want to go for Crushing Verdict and eventually Heart of Wrath is totally up to you. I don't usually, mostly because Heart of Wrath here doesn't offer enough fire damage to really be worth that much of a skill point investment. And again, unless you're choosing physical damage, which you might, again, it's totally up to you, you don't necessarily want Crushing Verdict, right? Again, even with a focus on physical damage, I still prefer Judgment. Alright, if I'm focusing on physical damage, by the way, I'll drop Volcanic Stride and Volcanic Might, and I'll go for Crushing Verdict. If I'm focusing on that physical damage, right? Basically, it's just a mild swap between the two skills. It really depends. Physical, get Crushing Verdict. Fire, get the Volcanic Stride and the Volcanic Might. Now comes, of course, the last 17 points, and this is going to be something you're going to adjust depending on your needs. Alright, a lot of the times, I really like to put a couple of points into Presence of Virtue, right? I'll usually put between 3 and 5, and then I'll either max out Resilience, because it's just incredibly useful, or maybe I max out Smite for some extra stun, some extra fire damage, and put, 2 more points in here. It really depends on where you want to put the points. If you're going for physical, obviously, instead of Smite, you would be going for Shattering Smash if you're going for that physical, because this reduces enemies' physical protection. You could also just as easily, instead of putting your points into Resilience, if you're focusing on the fire damage, you could grab Ascension. Also a possible option. Now, I've left this up here, right, because if you really wanted to, you could also put these points into Temper if you really wanted to. If you're focusing on physical damage, you're going to want to. But if you don't want to do that, you can actually pull all these points back, grab an extra 20 points, and you can go really ham over here, right? You can max out Presence of Virtue. You could go all the way to Haven if you really want to. We are using a shield, so it's totally a viable option here. Put the last couple of points in Resilience or Smite or Ascension or any combination of these, right? What you want to do with these last, say, 27 points is going to be purely a matter of what you feel you need. If you're in hardcore, you're going to want to go more for that defensive option, so you're going to want to max resilience in a hardcore game just to, keep yourself alive a little bit longer. And you would probably also want to put the remainder into Presence of Virtue, more for the energy regeneration and the offensive ability increases than anything else. Or maybe you want to splash them into Ascension for those really high danger moments. You bust out Ascension, you're getting that damage absorption in there, totally all, you could actually theoretically, if you're doing hardcore, and this is what I normally run on hardcore right here, is this a lot of the times. If I'm going up against an area that very specifically has crowd control, I will temporarily drop the points in resilience and put them into clarity of purpose. Places I typically do this is anywhere with skeletal gargantuans, who are the biggest offenders of this. They are the most spooky individuals. The first half of the Astrakarn Mountains with the Yetis, that is somewhere else that I typically bust out clarity of purpose. Outside of those areas specifically, it's not something I use a lot of the time because those are the two really big crowd control areas. The Yeti's freeze lasts a bit longer than I'm comfortable with, and of course I've constantly railed on the evils of the skeletal gargantuans, but most other freezes, most other routes don't last long enough where you're likely to die as long as you have resilience. So it's those specific areas where I'll make that point shift to clarity of purpose. The rest of the time, I'm not going to be busting this out, right? But that, that's just generally what I run on hardcore a lot of the time. But if I'm running on the regular, right, I'm running a regular character, then I'll go with Haven and either max Smite or Shattering Smash, depending on whether I'm going physical or fire, and then put the rest of the points in resilience a lot of the time, right? Or maybe I'm feeling really bold and I go for Rebuke. Not a huge deal, right? But how you apply these, maybe you want to do much more damage, maybe you want to do that physical focus. All right, you can absolutely do that. Just pop these points up here, max temper, and then you can just throw in the last 2 points in resilience if you really want to, or put the 2 more into Presence of Virtue for some more energy regeneration. Totally, how you run these last few points, totally up to you, right? But again, if we're talking about single-hand melee with a shield, absolutely Flame Touched is a great choice here, especially if you're focusing on fire damage. You do really want Vindictive Flame. By the way, quick note, you could also go Blackwater Cocktail with high potency. Alright, this is actually decently good for keeping yourself alive. This is surprisingly a large amount of damage. You don't necessarily need to go all the way to Demon Fire. First off, that's another 10 points into the mastery bar. Second off, there is chaos damage that you're just not doing, and the increase in burn damage and the reduced target damage is just not worth it, generally speaking. But the reduced offensive ability, that can come in clutch sometimes, and with the high potency increasing the radius there and slowing enemy attacks, this can really help keep you alive. The damage eventually does fall off. You'll find this is really effective in the early to mid game, and in, say, ultimate difficulty, this is going to fall off to some extent, depending on how much you're focusing on fire damage. But if you are focusing on fire damage, this is a decent option and will remain, even in ultimate difficulty, even if it's not packing the same punch as it used to, it's still really great for slowing enemy attacks and reducing their offensive ability. It's still really nice for that, okay? So this is also, just a quick aside, a totally viable option here, if you want that as well. Of course, if you really want to save points, or if you want to go a little bit more diverse than this, instead of going Righteous Fervor, you can 100% go with the slightly less skill point intensive Fire Strike and go for the modifier of Searing Strike, and this gives you 35 points to kick around with, so you can max resilience, you can max in this case we'd be doing fire damage for the fire strike, you can max smite. You can absolutely go for Blackwater Cocktail and run the high potency, or you can go for, say, you could go for full Presence of Virtue, or you could go for full Ascension, or you could drop the Resilience and go for Presence of Virtue and Haven, and on top of that you could go Rebuke if you really wanted to, or, you know, any combination. Again, how you want to run that really is up to you, but pretty much the constants you really should be taking away is, for a single-hand melee with shield, you really want Vire's Might. You really want to be grabbing the Vindictive Flame. It's an amazing combination. Again, if you're playing with friends, Judgment is a huge deal. If you're not playing with friends, don't bother, right? You don't need it. I mean, if you really want to use Judgment, even in a single-player game, go for it, right? But there are slightly better options. I mean, if we're talking about crowd control from a single-player standpoint without the need to taunt, Smite is going to do that for free. It's not going to cost energy. It's going to, obviously, it won't hit as many people. It has a 3-target maximum, but it's still, you know, happening every so often. It's free. It combos really well, by the way, with Explosive Strike because it's already weakening enemies in that kind of area. You know, you've got these options, but that's totally up to you. But yeah, for a Shieldbreaker, single-hand melee, get that Vire's Might, run with the Vire's Might, whether you choose physical or fire damage, totally up to you, but you want it, and you want to combine it with Vindictive Flame. Even if you're doing physical damage, grab Vindictive Flame. It's just too useful in a melee build to not run, okay? So there's a lot of leeway here. Again, my only real constants are Safeguard, Vire's Might, Vindictive Flame, Divine Mandate, obviously, and of course, also obviously the Guardians of Empyrean with the Celestial Presence, just because regardless of whether you focus on physical or fire damage, you're going to want that resistance reduction, right? Now, how does this change for, say, single-hand guns with the shield, right? The only real change, if you choose to use a gun instead of a melee weapon, the only real change is that Fire Strike stops being a viable option. Why? Primarily because, as I mentioned before, it really isn't going to keep up with Righteous Fervor in any reasonable response, and the only way it is seriously going to keep up with it in any capacity is through either Searing Strike or Searing Might. Alright, neither of these enhance single-hand guns. This is specifically two-handed anything, and this is specifically one-handed melee. So if you're using a gun, if you choose to use a gun, I say one change, there's actually two. The first change is you would not have Fire Strike. It's just not going to keep up with Righteous Fervor. Alright? Just right off the top. That isn't going to happen. The second change you'll be making is you will not want Vire's Might. You're using a gun, you don't want to be in melee. As a direct result of that, you also, obviously, do not want Vindictive Flame. You are basically playing Keep Away because you've got a gun, right? It just makes sense. You instead are going to want Aegis of Men here, so you can ideally chain stun multiple incoming targets, right? Whether or not you go for Reprisal is totally up to you. If you're going fire damage, it's generally worth it. If you're going physical, it's more of a preference thing. And essentially, at this particular point, you actually are going to, with the gun, you actually do want to be putting some more points into Oathkeeper, right? Now you might be wondering, well, Professor, Vindictive Flame gives you increased speed, which you would theoretically want with a gun, and yes, that is true. If you want to continue using Vindictive Flame, that's fine, but you're primarily going to be putting anywhere from 1 to 16 points in Vindictive Flame for health regeneration and speed increases, right? Because you're really not looking to have enemies wander within that 3.8 meter range, right? You're a ranged character. That's not really an ideal scenario for you, right? So we really aren't looking to do that. Again, you can if you want to, but I actually a lot of the times prefer using different tools. I usually use Granado here, because we are talking about a guaranteed knockdown for anything small enough to be knocked down. Obviously, larger enemies can't get knocked down, but a lot of those can get stunned, so you Aegis those guys. And I also really like to use Blackwater Cocktail. Now, Blackwater Cocktail I don't use for the damage, right? I mentioned earlier that the damage falls off in Ultimate typically. That's not why you use Blackwater Cocktail in a gun build, a single-hand gun build. Right, the reason you use Blackwater Cocktail in a single-hand gun build is specifically so you can throw this at enemy ranged and slow down their attacks while you blast the melee guys. Right, this does wonders for that specific reason. This is absolutely lovely. Okay, and you can huck this thing a really far distance. You will be very surprised because that 5.8 meter radius right there, that's its fire range. That's not how far you can chuck this thing. Okay, you can lob this a really long distance. So in most cases, you're going to be able to land some fire on those ranged enemies and be less concerned about incoming ranged damage. Okay, so I love Blackwater Cocktail with single-hand gun builds on the Shieldbreaker, but what else you use here is, again, going to primarily change. We're still kicking around with a good 22 points. If you're having energy problems, you want, obviously, Presence of Virtue, and a lot of the times I am running max Presence of Virtue here, just because I do want that energy, I do want that internal trauma, right? It's just absolutely fantastic. Something we really actually do want. Whether or not you go into Haven is totally up to you. In Hardcore, I tend to run either this or Ascension, because, quite honestly, even though we're not looking to be in melee, we still get shot. So the, Haven actually still pulls some weight here. You could also do, of course, Resilience if you really wanted to as well for an emergency bolstering of your defense. But generally speaking, again, for a single-hand ranged build, I typically run Aegis a lot of the time. It's just more broadly useful for, again, blocking those shots from enemies. But this is really where you adjust for single-hand gun, right? There's just no need for Fire Strike. There's no huge need for Vindictive Flame, although if you want to put 10 points into Vindictive Flame instead of in Haven, totally up to you. Granado is great. We really don't need high impact because we're not using Granado for the damage. It's why we don't really need to go all the way for the Blackwater Cocktail. We're using it primarily for the high potency here and for the reduced offensive ability, which makes the enemies miss more often. They attack slower. It really helps keep the ranged enemies from being a problem for you. This is generally what I adjust for the single-hand ranged. Alright, now we talk about two-handed weapons, two-handed equipment, right? Now, let me actually put in a brief word here to talk about two-handed guns, because the only difference between two-handed guns and single-hand guns is, first off, you obviously don't have a shield with a two-handed gun, so you don't use Aegis of Men here. Alright, these points go elsewhere. Now, where these points go is, again, primarily up to you, but with a with a two-handed gun, I actually do go all the way for high impact on Granado. You might be wondering, Professor, why? Why bother with that? The primary reason is because with a two-handed gun, you're obviously shooting much harder, right? That goes pretty much without saying. And as a result of that, the actual increased damage here on high impact is really going to help you crowd control. A second reason is because if I'm using a two-hand gun, I'm actually not going to be using Righteous Fervor. You see, when I use a two-handed gun on Shieldbreaker, my actual preference is for Fire Strike, for a couple of reasons. I actually grab Static Strike in only this specific circumstance, because I don't care about the lightning damage, I don't even care about the fire damage. I want that 25% knockdown. Combine that with the knockdown from Granado. Basically what you do is you throw Granado, and then you blast anyone that you know won't be hit by that, which, depending on how familiar you are with Granado's blast radius, you'll figure that out as you get more experienced with it. But for the two-handed gun, I want that knockdown chance. I don't care about the lightning, and I don't care about the fire. I'm looking for that knockdown chance. If you want to throw a couple points into Stun Jacks or Vindictive Flame to increase your attack speed, or Stun Jacks as an emergency measure, you can absolutely do so. I generally don't. Alright, obviously, by the way, we don't want Haven either. What I do usually run in these specific circumstances is I'll be honest, I do typically run Vindictive Flame here. Alright, you do have a different option as well. Vindictive Flame for the attack speed. Again, we're looking at, really quick, we're looking at trying to knock down people on a 25% chance. Increasing our attack speed is going to make that happen, obviously, more frequently. But if you really don't want Vindictive Flame, you can also grab Canister Bomb instead and just put the points here for a lovely chance to stun people instead. You have that option as well, and then you could put say, the last two into Vindictive Flame if you really wanted to. I just personally prefer to just chuck it all into Vindictive Flame, in all honesty, because we have that nice increase in attack speed. And then, of course, we can put 1 point into Olzwin's Wrath, just because, at that point, really, why not? But another nice thing about Vindictive Flame is actually that health regeneration helps us more with the two-handed gun, because we don't have the shield to block ranged attacks. Yes, we still are using the Molotov cocktail, obviously, we still have all the other things, but we don't have the shield, right? Which is block chance, block damage. The health regeneration will help kind of compensate for that, okay? But yeah, this is really the only serious situation in which I will bust out Static Strike on a Shieldbreaker, is specifically for that two-handed gun build, right? The two-handed melee build is an entirely different together. Now, the two-handed melee build is an interesting experience, because, again, whether you run Fire Strike or Righteous Fervor comes down to, do you need to be tankier? Do you need to be clearing out waves of enemies? Are you playing with friends? All of the same things that I talked about at the start with the single-hand melee also applies to the two-handed melee. But one thing we absolutely want is Olzwin's Wrath maxed, because we're actually going to be there, we're going to be, close by. We don't have a shield, so we want Olzwin's Wrath for primarily two reasons. First, 20% of that damage is being converted to health. Now, this is not massive damage, but it'll help resist things like Vitality Decay, Poison damage. Damage over time effects are effectively countered by this, as long as there's enough enemies nearby. More importantly, we have a 22% reduction of enemy damage every time they're hit by this, right? For 3 seconds. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot, but keep in mind that this affects up to 7 people. So we have 7 or 8 targets being hit here, and this activates every 1.5 seconds. So every 3 seconds, the first, let me put it this way, 1.5 seconds, 7 people zapped. Okay, those 7 targets have 22% reduced damage. Alright, another 1.5 seconds. The first one wears off, we get the second one kicking around. Actually, the first one hasn't even worn off yet. It's only 1.5 seconds. The first batch is only halfway through their effect. The second batch gets zapped. Another 3 seconds. Rinse, repeat, right? So for two-handed melee, I am a huge fan of Olzwin's Wrath purely on this basis. Alright? We don't necessarily use Blackwater Cocktail. Let me pull that out really quick. Again, go back to Vir's Might here, and again, whether you're going fire or physical is going to depend on, whether or not you grab Volcanic Might or Volcanic Stride. Now, a couple of other interesting things here, though, because we'll still want Presence of Virtue, because now we have a couple of different options, okay? Our first option is to go ham on the damage. This is one of the spin-to-win builds. Right, we can grab Eye of Reckoning, we can grab Soulfire, and we can just absolutely have a grand old time. And if you combine Soulfire specifically with the hideousness of Olzwin's Wrath, you are talking about a impressive damage reduction. We have 22% off of this every 1.5 seconds. We have Soulfire busting this out just on anybody you spin to win through, alright? So you're reducing all of this damage, and that really can help increase your survivability while spinning to win, okay? But this is specifically with the two-handed melee. Why don't I recommend this for single-hand melee? Well, primarily because the weapon damage from Eye of Reckoning goes a little bit farther, for one thing, and second off, we don't need the reduced damage as much here, right? This is also why I didn't necessarily recommend you build Olzwin's Wrath on the any of the shield ones, right? Can you build this wave for a single-hand melee? Sure, absolutely. You sure can, and it's going to make you absurdly tanky. By the way, if we're going two-handed melee, by the way, we don't have shield guard, obviously. It will make you absurdly tanky, absolutely. But you would then be sacrificing some points that you could put into Haven, which is going to give you a bit more durability directly with the increased block chance, with the increased block damage, with the increased health, right? You could do that instead, right? The resilience, which we can still afford here because we don't have a shield, so we don't have points in Safeguard. But by going into Soulfire, you might be sacrificing points you could be putting into Safeguard, which is going to increase your damage in general. It's going to increase your armor, right? And this only applies if you have a shield. So the problem with using the Soulfire build with a shield is, in terms of defensiveness, you're not gaining anything. And in a lot of cases, you're actually losing something. And with Safeguard especially, if you drop Safeguard in favor of going for Soulfire, which I recommend against, but you could, in theory, so running with this particular idea, you are losing that potential increase in damage we just talked about, right? And you can see going up here with just 3 points, you're losing that, you're losing the armor, you're losing the physical damage, which helps more with single-hand weapons. Furthermore, while 28% isn't a lot, it's obviously a pretty low percentage. That 28% goes quite a bit farther on a two-handed melee weapon than it is ever going to go on a one-handed melee weapon, right? It is a huge difference in terms of those two weapons' damage, their baseline damage output. And while 28% mitigates that gap, it's still a decent enough gap where I personally recommend running. If you're going to spin to win, do it with style and a bigger weapon, right? Because you're not going to be sacrificing anything to get Eye of Reckoning on a technical level, right? Because again, you don't have a shield, so there's a whole bunch of skills you just can't get. You can't use Aegis of Men here. You can't use any of these 3 passives at the top here. None of those are on the board. You can't get that much out of Haven. You only get the health and the healing effects, which is half of Haven in the first place. So why the hell would you get Haven with the two-hand melee weapon, right? I mean, Resilience doesn't require a shield or use a shield, but, you know, one of the really big reasons we like Resilience is for the turtle shell constellation effect, which, right? The name of which escapes me. Let me remind myself really quick. Turtle shell, it actually literally is turtle shell, so I actually did remember it. Good on me. But we really like to slap that on there, and that's a shield thing, right? Because that is the constellation increases your block chance and everything. So while we can use Resilience here, it's still slightly better with shields, given that we can actually stretch that defensive ability a little bit farther with shields, because, again, blocking. But you can, again, I have it set up here for a reason. I still like using Resilience with this setup, right? Resilience is really my go-to for a lot of my spare points, okay? Absolutely. It's just absolutely fantastic. You wouldn't want Judgment, though, because you aren't necessarily going to want to taunt the enemy. The interesting thing about using two-handed melee weapons for a lot of builds is you're basically setting up a slugfest, and whoever hits hardest wins. Right? It has nothing to do with block chance or anything like that, right? It's just an absolute slugfest. But if you don't want Resilience, right, you can obviously do good old Blackwater Cocktail instead. I generally don't prefer that, right? I just like to blast on Vindictive Flame and Olzwin's Wrath. I like to spin. If you don't like spinning, totally fine. You can go Judgment. It is going to do a lot of damage. It's just going to make your life a little bit riskier. You could also go into Ascension if you wanted to go for, kind of a really aggressive, use Ascension when you need to type of build, which is absolutely fine if you want to run that. You could use Judgment to pull enemies in right beforehand, which is probably the best use of Judgment with a two-handed melee weapon. You could also, if you really wanted to, throw some points into Temper to increase your physical damage if you really wanted to, right? You have that option as well. You could also throw in stun jacks because you are in melee range and you don't have a shield, so the stun and the damage from stun jacks would actually be pretty nice. So you have that option as well, right? If you're not going to spin to win, you could absolutely bust out stun jacks, which aren't hugely necessary. Yes, they've always been available. I want to make that very clear. Stun jacks have always been a viable option, but because it's physical and lightning damage, it hasn't been necessarily something massively, massively important. But in this particular circumstance, because you don't have all of those defensive bonuses from the shield and its accompanying skills, you might actually want to think about investing in stun jacks for the stun. You don't necessarily need full spread. I just put that there so I would, I can talk about it right here with the full stats. You don't need full spread for this because the main point of grabbing stun jacks is, of course, getting the stun. The increase in projectiles might be something you want. That's going to be down to your preference. But this is, a lot of the times when I run a two-hand melee build on Shieldbreaker, I am 100% running Spin to Win. Now, you might be wondering, well, Professor, if you're running Spin to Win, why bother with Fire Strike? Right? Why even bother with any of this? Why would you run Searing Might? What's the point here? Why not, say, instead run Righteous Fervor? Well, the reason why is because Spin to Win, you're not always going to have the energy for, right? It's very energy intensive. Even if we're running Presence of Virtue and we have a lot of equipment that runs energy regeneration, unless we're absolutely going out of our way to spike our energy regeneration at the expense of maybe some other stats, we're not always going to be able to spin to win. So having either Fire Strike or Righteous Fervor is a really great backup to waiting for your energy to recharge. Because the basic run through here is, alright, I'm going to Virus Might into the middle of the enemies, and then spin to win until I run out of energy, and then at that point, I'm going to be blasting people with either Fire Strike or Righteous Fervor. Which one? Totally up to your preference. Again, if you want to run the fire damage focus here, you want to be grabbing Volcanic Stride, you probably will be pulling points not out of Presence of Virtue. You'll probably be pulling points out of Resilience for that. Presence of Virtue with its energy regeneration is too important to spinning. Or, again, you could run Volcanic Stride instead of the Eye of Reckoning and Soulfire. You could run, and I just want to sample this really quick. You could absolutely run, actually, theoretically, if you really wanted to, you could just run the fire version of Eye of Reckoning and then just the Volcanic Stride here, obviously, right? Absolutely an option, of course. Put 2 points into Temper just for a little bit of extra damage there. But you would still want Olzwin. Well, you wouldn't necessarily need Olzwin's Wrath for that at that particular point. If you really wanted Ascension or you really wanted to max Temper, you could do that. But again, that's going to be mostly a matter of your personal preferences. But at the end of the day, regardless of what build you're running, these two are constants. Guardian of Empyrean, Celestial Presence, Divine Mandate. Always. But the rest of these are going to depend on your weapon. Primarily, your weapon. Okay? But I hope that this really better explained how I approach improving the Shieldbreaker's skills. The next episode we'll be talking about the devotions for the Shieldbreaker, which is a little bit more straightforward than solo Oathkeeper, because again, you're really looking at that physical and fire damage, so there's really primarily only two ways you're running with this. Okay? But we'll talk about that next episode. So with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.